You know, we have a number of questions here at the outset. If anybody wants to dive in and start to answer or offer some ideas, you know, what is your vision of an ideal jazz archive? And do you have a favorite repository that you've worked in, and why, and what, you know, other programs could serve as models, and what types of materials should we collect? How should we go about the process? What geographic areas should we cover, and on and on. So again, there's no sort of agenda. If anybody wants to jump in, and if not, I'm going to just point to somebody. Yes, Diane.
I think in terms of a vision, the ideal Philadelphia Jazz Archive to me would be accessibility to not only researchers and scholars, but also the community and jazz musicians, which means that collections, it's essential to have whatever you have processed and available for people. Because in too many cases, you know, people collect archival materials or have them, but they are not processed. So you don't know what's in there, and they just sit and they're not accessible. So
Diane is speaking as an archivist, and, as I am, but you know, processed is you have a mass of materials, and to organize it and describe it and put it in acid-free folders and boxes and catalog it so that it truly is accessible, as opposed to just, you know, here's the stuff.
And then it's online, so you can see it any place in the world, so people can come to the archives to do research.
I
in
was
the
thinking
digital
about
age.
something along those lines. Ultimately, if we can create a letter of commitment or an agreement that everybody who's taking part in this big picture vision, that we, what is it, a memorandum of understanding, that we have these fundamental, it's like standard of care, like in medical stuff, that what we value about the archive, whether you're an archivist or not, like, I don't know, you guys can talk about like the 10 commandments of how to take care of stuff. So that we agree, everybody who's participating agree to those fundamental understandings so that we can learn more. That we sort of, in that agreement, we agree to learn more and to do better with it. Because sometimes we collect and then we lose it, or it's not taken care of, or, so something that we all agree to a standard of care.
And the archival profession does have principles of practice, which we can sort of crib and adapt. I mean, that has to do with making collections equally accessible to all, and standards of professional care and preservation. So there is a template that we can, but that's a great idea too.
Just one more thing. One of the things, you know, when you talk about collecting, and Suzanne mentioned something right away about Shirley Scott and other materials. One of the things is, you know, and I think that's probably why you have me here,
Right.
Suzanne's here, those who have reach into the jazz community, you're not going to get the materials unless you have some credibility with them.
Exactly.
And so to get access to these things, especially when you talk about jazz musicians and so forth, if they don't trust you, or they don't, you know, you're not going to get access. And so that's important too.
Absolutely.
And which makes it even, you know, in terms of being a good steward. I know Suzanne and myself, you know, anything that's collected from these jazz musicians or people that we know, it better be taken care of, or we're going to hear about it. You know, it's our credibility.
Exactly.
Well, I was going to say, in keeping with that, I teach a course on August Wilson, and we partner with the West Philadelphia Cultural Alliance. And one of the things that we do is oral history with West Philadelphia residents, but we don't create an archive. In part because the University of Pennsylvania has such a history of taking things out of West Philadelphia.
Could you?
Yeah.
Stand by.
Stand by.
That history is so egregious that when we started to do the course, I promised the WPCA that anything that we took out in the way of interviews, they could have back. if they wanted it, or we would destroy the recording so that, because the archive thing, who owns it and whether or not somebody is giving us something into perpetuity, or whether or not they're giving it to us on loan. Those kind of understandings are really important, and people have been badly treated by archives in the past. And so the thing that is really important to me is that because musicians are our best resource, that they not feel in any way exploited by this project.
Let me,
All right. So, again, I think it's great that we're able to do this, and I think we're in a unique position to build this from the ground up. So, infrastructure, and I think as a model, having the blocks in something to point to, but also, I think the Chicago Jazz Archive is something.
Oh,
that
that's marvelous.
Yeah, I think we can learn a lot from those type of examples and the work that Lewis has done as well. But I think building that infrastructure, trying to put that in place, and also maintaining that, having the personnel to maintain that. That comes along with that accessibility. If somebody reaches out to the Philadelphia Jazz Archive or whatever the name might be, are they going to be able to find somebody there? Is there going to be somebody? Is there going to be some infrastructure in place? So I think trying to develop that aspect of it is something that we need to pay specific detailed attention to as well.
I was going to make a pitch for a multidisciplinary perspective. And we've been talking about musicians, but the jazz aesthetic has affected the arts broadly. Dancers, writers have inspired musicians, and vice versa. Next week, I'm working on a project now, the Philadelphia Europa Performance Project, where we look at the history and evolution of Yoruba-rooted performance practice in Philadelphia since the mid-20th century. And so we're bringing in someone to do an intensive residency who, an experimental theater artist who looks to jazz as a principal focus of her aesthetic. In fact, she wrote a book entitled Theatrical Jazz. So, we have to look at sustainability and infrastructure and what we're capable of doing well and for a sustained period of time. But at least at this point in time, it seems to me we ought to toss the net widely and think about all the forms that have been affected by jazz and that jazz has been affected by in this city.
Well, in Philadelphia, you have, for the cross-disciplinary, you've got like Charlie Rice, who started out as a tap dancer.
Yeah.
And then moved into drums. And what I liked about the Chicago site, and I've been looking at a lot of different archival sites, was they kind of put jazz in a social, economic, historic context where you had jazz and the Great Migration. Well, in Chicago, that would be a huge part of it. But a lot of people don't know what a huge part of the Great Migration it was in Philadelphia. So, you know what I mean? So putting it in that context as well, just throwing history in there and social movements, and I would envision that as part of this too.
There's so many layers. I think it's a phenomenal opportunity, and again, all the media opportunities, to show those connections. But I think we are at a special point right now, convening and starting something really significant, and looking at some of the models that are already in place, and stealing a little bit of what's out there as well as we go forth. But again, I think in association with the blocks, and I don't know what's possible in that regard, or just from a visionary standpoint.
Sure.
I think the fundamentals that are in place and the work that Diane has done is significant, and we use the word credibility. I don't think there's any entity in Philadelphia that has more credibility when it comes to archival activity. So I think there's a lot that we can play with.
I love.
What you said in terms of migration in Philadelphia, everyone, this man staring at us right now, that's Jimmy Adams, who came up with the concept with the Clef Club, and he migrated from Nashville, Tennessee, and came to Philadelphia in 1935.
Oh, gosh, I was wondering who he was when I came in.
That's Jimmy Adams.
That's right.
James Euclid Adams.
That's right.
I want to say I love the fact that we started and that you kicked things off with the idea of having everything accessible and having it online. I don't know if this is what you meant by that, but for me, having online also means not just listings, but actual materials. A lot of archives these days, Library of Congress actually is one of the leaders in this, is they're just putting their collections online.
It's great.
You know, you can look at the photo, you can look at the document, you can listen to the audio, you know, as much as permissions allow. I've noticed, in fact, some archives are overly cautious in terms of, you know, they have, I saw one archive has recordings from 1915, and they go, oh gee, we can't let you listen to this because of copyright. No, that copyright's long gone.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff you can have the actual items there. And I guess another thing is that doesn't in any way diminish the power and the importance of having a physical location. It's simply, you know, there's thousands of people that can't get there in person or couldn't get there often. And there's ways to keep track of how many people are using the site, so it still counts in terms of use of the archive. You know?
Well, to piggyback on that, one of the questions is where would the Philly Jazz Archives live? So looking way ahead, one place to be considered is 2125 Ridge Avenue. You may know that as the building with the Pearl Bailey, that mural. That's 2125 Ridge Avenue. That is also the former location of the Checker Club, which was a jazz joint back in the 1930s, and then later in the 80s became the Checker. It was a Checker Cafe at first, and then in the 80s became the Checker Club. And long story short, PHA, Philadelphia Housing Authority, wanted to demolish it. We saved it. And so that building will likely be available, and PHA is committed to selling it to a nonprofit for $1 if they have the resources to it definitely does need to be rehabilitated, to rehabilitate it and to maintain it. And so it's a perfect location, not too far from Temple, right there, corner bridge in Oxford, and there's so much history in that building.
Another location that's been floated is the Coltrane House, you know, which
Yeah.
a little further afield geographically, but, you know, also,
Yeah, it would be ideal.
yeah.